Raid encounters in WoW have grown more complex with every
Okay.
Raid encounters in WoW have grown more complex with every
Let's watch some Irmared decks. I love this YouTuber. Really chill YouTuber. If you love World of Warcraft, subscribe. Leave this man a like. He really does like an honest job that is really like enjoyable. So let's check out top 10 red bosses that were the first of their kind. Really curious to see that.
expansion. But some bosses didn't just follow trends, they created them. And in this video, we're going to go over some raid bosses that were the first to introduce mechanics or design philosophies that changed how future encounters were built.
This is interesting.
And at number 10, we have Blackwater Behemoth, found in the Internal Palace raid from Battle for Azeroth, which was the third boss of the instance, and one of the most mechanically distinct encounters in modern WoW. The raid itself was set in the drowned city of Nashatar and dealt heavily with Naga and aquatic corruption themes. But Blackwater Behemoth took this aesthetic one step further. The fight was the first raid encounter to fully commit to an underwater environment, where players had to swim, manage 3D positioning, and deal with water-based hazards across multiple aquatic platforms. The boss itself remained.
This is actually surprising that it took like until Battle for Azeroth for this to happen, don't you think? Like, I find it surprising, like, don't you think? Battle for Azeroth, first underwater raid boss. I thought it would have been like, it would have been made like a long time ago.
Mostly stationary, but the movement between platforms forced the raid to coordinate as they swam past electric jellyfish and timed bioluminescence in order to not get eaten. While underwater mechanics have been used in dungeons and world content before, raid fights had largely avoided them due to the historically clunky movement and targeting systems underwater. Blackwater Behemoth challenged this stigma by making swimming not just a theme, but a core mechanic. Although reception was mixed, and many players finding underwater physics difficult to manage, it paved the way for Blizzard to experiment further with terrain-specific mechanics, like moving through fog in Castle Nathria, or shifting elevation phases in fights like Raszageth. Blackwater Behemoth may not have started a trend, but it broke a long-standing design taboo, proving that most avoided mechanics could be viable in a raid setting with proper structure, and of course attaching them to an easy boss that's not that hard. And at number 9,
yeah, I think that this is also like really important to not like create this like complete impossible encounter, well, like with a new type of like with clunky or awkward type of like movement mechanic.
we have Kael'thas Sunstrider, the final boss of Tempest Keep in the Burning Crusade. Kael'thas wasn't just
That is the coolest boss that was done by almost no one. This
just a charismatic lore character. He was a structural innovation in raid design. The fight against Kael'thas was one of the first raid encounters to feel like a multi-act narrative experience, divided into 3 distinct phases that challenged every aspect of a raid's group's capabilities. The encounter begins with players fighting 4 of Kael'thas' advisors, each one with their own dangerous mechanics. Then comes a phase where legendary weapons drop, which players must equip and use for the remainder of the fight. The subsequent stages include simultaneous ad reactivations, flying phases, and Kael'thas himself warping reality with a gravity lapse. This was the first time a raid boss featured an encounter that felt like a mini dungeon in of itself, a sequence of escalating challenges rather than a single cohesive rotation. Importantly, it was also the first to give players new tools, the legendary weapons, mid-fight, and require that they adapt to new mechanics using unfamiliar resources. Later bosses would borrow heavily from Kael'thas' format. Yogg-Saron and Ulduar used phase insanity mechanics and unique ad sequences. Lei Shen and Throne of Thunder offered power distribution decisions across several stages. Even more recently, bosses like Anduin Wrynn and Sepulchre of the first ones incorporated story phases and toolkits that temporarily changed gameplay. Kael'thas' fight structure was revolutionary for its time. For better or for worse, it introduced a model of raid design where a boss encounter could become an entire experience rather than just a singular event. And at number 8, we have Archimonde, the final boss of the Battle for Mount Hyjal raid in the Burning Crusade. And while the raid itself was built around wave-based trash gauntlets, Archimonde stood out for introducing a groundbreaking concept: forced player agency through personal responsibility mechanics. At the time, most raid mechanics were binary. You either succeeded as a group or failed as a group. Archimonde disrupted the model with a single spell, Airburst. This ability launched individual players into the air, and they were required to use a unique item, the Tears of the Goddess, to slow fall before hitting the ground. Forgetting or mistiming this action resulted in instant death, with no possibility of rescue by others. This design was among the first to place the burden of survival entirely on the individual.
This is interesting, and this is like the type of encounter that like probably broke some guilds, because people were like, actually, like, now that we think of you like the fucking hunter, why are you so bad at the game? Get the fuck away from here.
Making each player accountable for their reaction time and awareness. It also encouraged strategic item management in a way that hadn't seen before. The legacy of this approach can be seen in numerous later fights. Mythic Killjade and Soak assignments, and even the Jailer's Ball mechanics all force individual players to act correctly, or else wipe the entire raid. By making every raider personally accountable, he pushed encounters away from passive execution and towards skill-based interaction. And at number 7, we have Vyrah, the final boss of Trial of Crusader and Wrath of the Lich King. And while the raid is often criticized for its lack of visual diversity, Vyrah introduced one of the most influential tanky mechanics of its time, the concept of active healing absorption as a damage enrage. The fight included a unique twist on the healing metagame. Instead of the boss becoming stronger over time via traditional buffs or phases, Vyrah periodically applied a debuff to the raid that caused healing to become a liability. Specifically, his Leeching Swarm leached a percentage of your team's current health, meaning that overhealing or topping players off too aggressively would actively harm the group. This mechanic forced healers to completely rethink their normal strategies. Managing health thresholds, timing heals, and coordinating cooldowns became essential to not only survival, but preventing wipe conditions. For the first time, healing too much was just as dangerous as healing too little. This design had ripple effects. Fights like Chimeron and Blackwing Descent and Mythic Ursock and Emerald Nightmare played with similar health management principles. Later still, bosses like Mythic Sledgefish punished overhealing by tying boss power to player HP values. Vyrah took what was previously seen as a support role and made it central to encounter success. It wasn't just a DPS or tanking race, it was a healing puzzle where the normal instinct to save everyone could backfire catastrophically. And at number 6, we have the Spine of Deathwing, the penultimate encounter of the Dragon Soul Raiden Cataclysm, which presented players with a boss fight unlike anything that came before. The fight took place on Deathwing's back, as the raid attempted to rip the armor-plating shield off of his corrupted body. The core mechanic revolved around balancing damage, movement, and adds, while Deathwing barrel rolled through the air. Players had to anchor themselves during rolls by grouping together, or risk being flung into the maelstrom below. Simultaneously, they had to manage multiple types of adds, including amalgamations, that required precise explosion timing and corruption tentacles that punished slow reactions. Spine was the first fight to use the physical environment itself as a critical mechanic. The boss wasn't an enemy you stood in front of and damaged. It was a setting that responded to player movement and behavior. It introduced dynamic spatial ability as a primary threat. The model was later echoed in fights like Blackhand and Blackrock Foundry, who transitioned across multiple destructible levels. Even Halandrus and Sepulchre of the first ones borrowed the concept of multi-stage physical space traversal as a mechanic. Though controversial in execution, many players found the fight overly repetitive or dependent on class-specific burst damage.
Yeah, the Spine of Deathwing, like Deathwing in general, was quite I don't know. It was quite a disappointing fight, at least on my part, and like, I don't know.
Spine of Deathwing marked the beginning of Blizzard treating bosses as environments and not just targets. It demonstrated that the very ground beneath a raid group could become both ally and adversary depending on how it was used. And at number 5, we have Ishkar the Unscarred, who was a mid-raid boss in Hellfire Citadel, the final raid of Warlords of Draenor. Though not a final boss, Ishkar left a lasting impression due to one key mechanic that set it apart: targeted player interaction via external item control, specifically the Eye of Anzu. During the fight, the raid had to manage a unique debuff cleansing item that passed manually between players. Whoever held the Eye of Anzu could remove specific debuffs or interact with shadow-based mechanics that would otherwise wipe the group. The catch? Only one person could hold it at a time, and it had to be thrown manually like a baton from player to player in real time. This was the first encounter where an item-based responsibility was deliberately rotated throughout the raid in a structured mechanic. Unlike other fights where individual roles were fixed, such as tanks or designated interrupt players, Ishkar required raid-wide awareness and trust, since any member might be next in the chain. Future fights would iterate on this idea. Star Augur and Nighthold had planetary orbs, debuff zones that had to be coordinated across roles. Mythic Jaina and Battle for Dazara lore used water orbs and fire stacks that required precise player communication to handle responsibility handoffs. Anduin Rin's fight reintroduced a structured item mechanic with hope buffs during the intermission phase. Ishkar pioneered the design of group mechanics where control and responsibility dynamically shifted across players, raising both the ceiling for coordination and the floor for failure. It wasn't just about playing your role, it was about sharing control of it. And at number 4, we have the Reliquary of Souls, a mid-raid boss in Black Temple, which was one of the earliest attempts at dramatically altering core gameplay mechanics mid-encounter.
Let me just check something real quick. Let me just check something. Okay.
Expansion. The fight was split into 3 distinct phases, each tied to one of the boss's essences: suffering, desire, and anger, and each one fundamentally changed how players interact with their own class mechanics. Phase 1 made all forms of regeneration useless. No mana, no energy, no rage. Players had to rely solely on what they entered with. Phase 2 reversed the problem by creating a damage reflection effect, punishing players who did too much too quickly. Phase 3 amped up the raid-wide damage and forced movement and positioning to become priority 1. This was the first fight that directly interfered with player resource generation on a macro scale. Most raid mechanics up to this point focus on positioning, interrupts, or ad control. Reliquary introduced what would be described as environmental debuffs applied to the raid's entire functionality. Later fights would borrow heavily from this design philosophy. General Vezax and Ulduar would also suppress mana regeneration entirely. Mythic Zanesh and Ny'alotha played with similar themes of resource denial and personal burden. Even Shadow Lord Ishkar's rotating Eye of Anzu was thematically a nod to unique phase toolkits. Reliquary of Souls broke the idea that raid encounters should be about perfecting a rotation. It asked, what if you had to abandon your usual toolkit entirely? It forced players to adapt not to the boss's damage, but to their own limits, a concept that would shape many of WoW's most difficult encounters. And at number 3, we have Darumu the Forgotten, who was encountered in the second half of Throne of Thunder, and is remembered most for one thing: the maze phase. But it's what this phase represents in terms of encounter design that earns it a place so high on this list. Darumu was the first boss to use a real-time visual obstruction puzzle as a primary fight mechanic. In the maze phase, the room filled with fog, and players had to position themselves precisely along narrow safe paths, revealed only by a thin beam of light emitted by the boss. Everyone else was blinded, and moving even slightly outside the correct line meant death. This wasn't just a dance mechanic, it was a vision test. No indicators on the ground, no voice alerts, just pure spatial awareness and tight coordination. The maze segment completely changed the tone of the fight. While the rest of the encounter was based on ad control and beam alignment, the maze turned the boss arena into a deadly logic puzzle. Players had to learn not just where to move, but how to visually interpret minimal information. This mechanic became a blueprint for later fights involving visual deception. Mythic Kel'Thuzad's ice paths, and especially Mythic
Okay, this is interesting. Like a maze like you have to go through.
Melandris, with its high-speed avoidance sequences, all owe something to Darumu's design. Though originally infamous for its unclear visuals and steep learning curve, Darumu's maze was the first real attempt at using limited visibility as a mechanic, opening the door for Blizzard to embrace non-combat challenges inside combat encounters. And at number 2, we have the Lich King, the final boss of Icecrown Citadel, which is among the most iconic encounters in WoW's history. But beyond the cinematic significance and narrative payoff, the fight introduced a mechanic that would define modern encounter design: the intermission phase as a narrative device. The encounter opens with traditional mechanics: Valkyries abducting players, Defiles punishing poor positioning, and necrotic plagues as a spreading disease. But halfway through, the fight pauses. Arthas kills the entire raid in a scripted sequence before Tyrion intervenes, and you all get revived by the spirits inside Frostmourne. This was the first time an encounter used a full party wipe as a part of the encounter story. Rather than simply dealing damage or creating an enrage timer, the boss delivered a moment of narrative finality. and reversed it with lore-based mechanics. Later raids borrowed from this heavily. Gul'dan used similar scripted defeat moments in Nighthold. Sylvanas' phase transitions in Sanctum of Domination also leaned into cinematic storytelling as a gameplay structure, and Argus from Legion even just kind of copies the whole raid wipe mechanic and iterates on it. Mechanically speaking, Lich King also pioneered phase design that altered terrain itself. The transition to the Frozen Throne's edge, the shattering floor, and the need for raid-wide repositioning all became staples of future high-end fights. The Lich King redefined what a raid boss could be.
Yeah, the Lich King was really and is really quite the success story of how do you actually like make a raid boss feel like the ultimate threat, the ultimate enemy. And I think that like as much as like I won't talk about it right now, Blizzard really successfully made it so Arthas, the Lich King, became this ultimate threat, and the fight that we got to experience as players really reflected well on the identity of this antagonist, this enemy.
He was not just a gameplay challenge, but a set piece built to evoke a climax. It was the first time Blizzard fully integrated game mechanics, encounter phases, and narrative structure into a single cohesive experience. The Lich King is commonly mentioned in dev interviews as the inspiration for epic final fights going forward. And at number 1, we have Hegan the Unclean, who was not
Egan the Unclean, the first boss that learned you, teached you how to dance.
a final boss. He wasn't especially difficult in terms of raw damage or in rage timers. But in Naxxramas, both in its original classic version and its Wrath of the Lich King re-release, Hegan changed everything by introducing a mechanic so foundational that it became part of WoW's design language, the dance phase. The fight centers around safe zones that shift across the platform in a repeating pattern. Stand in the wrong spot and you're instantly killed. What made this mechanic revolutionary was that it wasn't reaction-based in the traditional sense. It was memory-based. Players had to internalize and execute a movement sequence rather than responding to a warning. At the time, this kind of precise rhythmic movement wasn't expected in raids. Most fights involved standing still or executing rotations. Hegan broke that mold. Success wasn't about numbers, it was about spacing, timing, and repetition. The dance mechanic became a template. Modern mythic fights like Anduin Wrynn or Raszageth borrowed heavily from the idea that movement, memory, and platform awareness are key to success. Hegan didn't look flashy, he wasn't a final boss tier, but his encounter redefined what a raid mechanic could ask of players. It was the first time Blizzard used consistent, pattern-based movements as a core test, and it's never really stopped using this since.
Okay, this was really interesting. Like I said, if you want some good wow content, subscribe to Iramar, the Iramar Dex. This man is really a fan. This man is really cool, and yeah, give him some love, you know.